Welcome. I'm really happy to welcome you to the panel number 1 on this very exciting Naturvation Conference. My name is Sandra Naumann. I work at the Ecologic Institute and I'm at the moment here in Berlin, Germany. And Ecologic is also a partner of Naturvation. And I'm very happy to moderate this session. But what is the session about? So we know there's an ongoing loss of biodiversity, as we saw in the last UN report, IPBES, and also the EU State of Nature report that's coming up. The progress towards our climate targets is still very slow, and we're still missing full commitments and consequent measures. From the local to the global level, there's an emerging debate on the role of biodiversity and healthy ecosystems as a way to achieve climate goals, but to use healthy ecosystems and nature to achieve climate goals, but also to adapt to climate change. And with this session, we will explore what contribution can urban nature-based solutions make to the key sustainability challenges of climate change and biodiversity. And to address this very complex question, we invited 3 excellent speakers from around the world who are building on their experience and will provide insights into various aspects of this very complex issue. And my first speaker is located in Santiago de Chile. Hello to Jennifer Leonard. She's the global lead of WWF Cities, which has engaged nearly 600 cities and 50 countries. And she has a PhD in urban climate governance from the Wageningen University and has more than 15 years of experience in addressing urban environmental challenges. She likes really much and is fascinated by urban design, which includes people and interacts with them in and with cities. And she has a blog, if you're interested, which is called The Urban Observer and has also been recognized by The Guardian Cities as one of the best city blogs. So in her speech, and you get the microphone in a sec, Jennifer, she will address and speak about the work the WWF is doing on nature and urban nature-based solutions that tries to connect cities with strategic ecosystems by restoring and protecting biological corridors for urban resilience for healthy cities and communities. And here is where I stop, and I will hand over to Jennifer here on stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's very much a pleasure for us to be here. Can you see my screen? Wonderful. Well, then I will go ahead and kick off. Yes, this is such a wonderful session, such a wonderful conference, and WWF is very happy to be a part of this extremely important topic on nature-based solutions and unlocking urban potential. In particular, here we're going to talk about sustainability challenges. So just as we get started, to definitely remember that I know this is probably not news to any of you, but just to set the context, that 55% of people are living in cities. Cities account for between 2 and 3% of landmass, and yet they are responsible for 70% of carbon emissions, 75% of natural resource consumption, and still they remain essential to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target and the Paris Agreement. So for us at WWF, and we acknowledge also the work of many of our partners here, including ICLE and so many others, we see that cities are a key space to look at how we can go towards a low carbon and green city future. In particular, we put a lot of focus on supporting cities in 1.5 degree alignment. This was where we were going, this was our vision, and then COVID happened. COVID has been a huge challenge, and many of us know, and I know several of the sessions will talk more about this, but between 90 and 95% of the cases have been occurring in cities. So cities are really the epicenter of so many challenges we face today, whether it's nature loss, climate change, as well as COVID. But how can we also see this as an opportunity? Cities already have so many challenges in terms of how they are designed. Between 40 and 60% of public space in cities is dedicated to cars. Urban sprawl has huge public service costs, and urban sprawl is expected to potentially increase because of COVID and people wanting to move to the outskirts of cities to be closer to nature. So how can we, in particular in our community, make sure that cities stay attractive and dynamic and that nature is found at the center of our cities as much as the outskirts of our cities? Obviously, there are challenges in terms of conversion of farmland, grasslands, and forests when we talk about sprawling cities as well. So this is an opportunity, a moment that is such a challenge for so many of us, but also an opportunity to really envision what kind of cities we want to live in: green cities, equitable cities, accessible cities. And the good news is we've already started to see this, whether it's Milan or Bogota, Santiago, where I am living, New York, London. So many cities are really realizing that we need to have better transportation systems, more focused on people-centric mobility, biking, walking, also public transport, but really places where people can move around and also socially distance in this world that we're living in. We've also seen, and this is the city that I live in, where streets have been given over to people in order to allow restaurants to economically recover, but to do so in a way that is viable to the socially distanced reality that we're living in. But how much greater can we see if we actually give streets to people instead of just to cars? We've also seen all around the world that there have been so many improvements in air quality, albeit temporary, but this is something that we can really harness and gain on. Now, I'm living in the beautiful city of Santiago de Chile, and this year they have had more wonderful views of the mountains than in the 30 years that passed before. Some of the best air quality that we have seen on record in recent years. And of course, this is about urban nature-based solutions, but that's so much connected also to the air we breathe. 90% of city dwellers breathe polluted air. Air pollution is responsible for about 7 million deaths per year. This is more affecting to our children, who are more vulnerable due to their rapid breathing. And traffic in our cities contributes both to air pollution and climate change, and certainly city design when we're talking about nature-based solutions. So how can we tap some of the challenges, but also the glimpses of what our future cities could look like? Well, already last year, WWF started to see the connection between air pollution and climate change, and really how can we galvanize citizens to feel part of the solution space. So we talked about urban movement, biking and walking in our cities, looking at how long people take to get to the office or to school, how they're moving around in their cities, how many people are dying from air pollution in that same average time slot. So if a citizen takes 30 minutes to get to work, how many people are dying? 500 are dying from air pollution. We subsidize with 268 million in fossil fuel subsidies in that same 30 minutes. But we could actually go the average commute time, which is 12 kilometers on an electric bike, to get to the same distance. And of course, this all connects to the nature that for the air quality that we breathe. So why am I talking about urban cycling when we're talking about urban nature-based solutions? Well, if we had an opportunity to re-green our cities and see our cities as more about biological corridors where transportation is one part of those streets, but it's also about greening, it's about people, it's about design. This is where we see a future for our cities. So we have worked, and increasingly so, this is a new area of development, mind you, for WWF, but how can we connect cities to nature, especially the nature protection on the outskirts of their cities? So we envision that connecting cities and ecosystems can be good for urban resilience, as well as healthy, active, and equitable communities. Now, cities are already connected to nature. By 2030, 40% of protected areas will be close to 50 kilometers from urban areas. So how can we really see that cities and nature are already a place for this connectivity? But for us, in our work, we're starting with climate change, and we're looking at how urban nature can support more resilient cities to be stronger and more resilient in face of storms, floods, landslides, and heat waves. But of course, there's also a space when we talk about urban heat design. Now, this is a graphic from our friends at Greenpeace, but it bears to show that street trees and urban greening has a huge potential for how we live in our cities. What kind of cooling systems? Can we use natural cooling systems, or do we use man-made cooling systems, and how we get around? And just kind of wrapping up here, the time is urgent and the time is now. 1.5 degrees Celsius is a record we don't want to break. We know it's a huge challenge, but we know it's an even greater challenge in our cities, because cities are warming faster than the temperature average at the at the national level or the global level. And Beijing, for example, could experience up to 6.1 degrees Celsius more under a business as usual scenario. So we need to act on this now. Within WWF, our key focus has been our One Planet City Challenge, where we work with cities to do their data reporting, and we see how closely they're aligned with that target of 1.5 degree, and we're trying to help them get there if they haven't gotten there already. Within the urban nature-based solutions space, we really want to see that cities are greening, but also that cities are advocating for nature protection further afield, not just in their cities, but in the products that they consume. How can we see that cities can advocate for nature protection further afield in the rainforests, in the boreal forests, in the different systems, because we know that nature is vital to our economy and our survival, as well as having a climate secure future. I want to close here with just reminding you that about a week ago, WWF released its Living Planet report, showing that since 1970, we have seen a 68% drop in the size of mammals, birds, fish, and amphibians. This is a drastic number. However, we do believe that there is a change where we can go into our future. So within WWF, we are calling, especially on key moments next year within the Biodiversity Summit, within the Climate Summit, and all related events, to call for what we're saying a new deal for nature and people. This is to have more ambitious targets by nation states, but also across key communities, across the business community, youth, and we definitely understand and recognize the vital role that cities play. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was quite dense and a very good presentation. And I also it really reminded me, like when you're talking like that, people prefer cars and parking lots over nature. And this is actually a phenomenon you can see all over the world. But I think it's also beautiful to see that once people experience what nature could be and could bring to the city, that they can also turn their minds and will accept it. And what I also like that you emphasized, it's not just about the nature in the cities, where at the moment a lot of focus is with nature-based solution, but actually the large share of biodiversity is outside the cities. And this is like really what we have to protect, but in a serious way. Otherwise, biodiversity is to decline further. Many thanks. And I forgot in the beginning to mention, it's not just presentations in these sessions. This is also an opportunity for everybody in the audience who would like to raise a question. To put it into the chat will be monitored, question will be pulled back to the speakers, and they will be addressed after the third presentation. So please use the chat function and pull the question. Ideally, you can already say to whom the question should be directed, and the shorter you can keep it, the better. Many thanks. That brings me to a cold country, to Finland, Helsinki, and I welcome very much Chris Raymond, who is a professor in sustainability science at the Helsinki Institute for Sustainable Science. He has a huge interest in nature-based solutions, sense of place, and the social valuation of ecosystem services, as well as conservation of biodiversity. And he's leading the Human Nature Transformation Research Group. And in his presentation, he will talk around the contribution of mosaic governance and multi-method approaches for engaging vulnerable groups in the design of nature-based solutions. And the insights will largely draw on a project called Viva Plan. And he will also bring up what are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities of bringing in people. Chris, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak today. I'm just waiting for my slides to come up. Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about how we can rethink nature-based solutions and biodiversity conservation through the eyes of vulnerable groups, and this relatively new concept called networks of care. And I'll be talking working through some insights in relation to a strategic research project that is ongoing called Viva Plan, funded by Formas in Sweden, which is the Applied Research, Natural Resource Research Institute. Could you switch slides, please? So I'm sure many of you have heard about it, but Copenhagen and Denmark more broadly has one of the most controversial policies in the world in regards to how we deal with not only green space but more widely residential areas that involve high levels of vulnerability. Back about 3 years ago, the Conservative government decided to implement what was called the Ghetto Plan. And since then, that has been adopted by the Danish left, recognising that for them to stay in government, they had to have quite a right-wing principle. And essentially what this Ghetto Plan does is it basically means it mandates for the gentrification, which is essentially the rebuilding of social housing areas that have three of the following criteria, where over 40% of adults aged 18 to 64 are not engaged in employment, where over 50% of residents have a non-Western nationality, where over 2.7% of residents aged 18 or over are convicted with criminal offences, and where more than 50% of residents with basic high school education or lower live, or where the average pre-tax income for people aged between 18 and 64 is less than 55% of the pre-tax income of the whole region. So there's been a lot of media discussion about this, and clearly it is discriminatory at some levels, but essentially what it is meaning for nature-based solutions is that a lot of these areas are being rebuilt. Nature is being removed, people are being removed. So there's this complex interplay between this whole sustainability challenge around social inclusion and inclusive cities, and also biodiverse and green cities. The question is, how do we start to engage these groups in a meaningful way to support biodiversity goals, but also social inclusion goals? So next. So the central aim of the project that I've been part of is to co-create nature-based solutions in vulnerable residential housing areas for nature conservation, social inclusion and human well-being. And our main thesis today is that in vulnerable residential housing areas, like those areas with high unemployment and people from different cultural backgrounds, biodiversity conservation is often not high on the agenda. Establishing and supporting networks of care are foundational to realising the wider biodiversity benefits of NBS. And I'll talk through what I mean by networks of care shortly. So next slide. So in Viva Plan, we recognise that engaging with vulnerable groups, there's no one silver bullet. We have to draw upon a range of approaches. So we have sound ethnography and other ethnographic approaches. We have participatory mapping, we have focus groups, we have institutional mapping. We also have this thing called a hackathon, which has been adopted from the tech industry, but where we try to confront head-on real-world challenges that residents have and invite people from all over the world, as well as local associations and NGOs, to work with residents to address those challenges. Next. And one of the case areas we're working in is called Urban Plan in Copenhagen. And just a quick overview, it has about 6,000 residents, 40% are unemployed, 50% only have a high education, most just have elementary school, yet 81% of people are pleased to live there. So that highlights that you can still be vulnerable, but still have a pleasure in living in a given place. But this area is on the ghetto map of the Danish government, not necessarily the whole area, but parts of this area are subject to redevelopment as we speak. Next slide. So what we've been doing in this is we've been trying to better understand the relationships between elements of environmental justice, and here we talk about procedural and recognition justice, and what people's values are for this area of urban plan. And there's a lot of complexity here, but essentially what we're finding is that people who self-report through surveys low recognition justice and low procedural justice are not necessarily valuing the environmental features of that area. They're valuing other things like sports and recreational infrastructure, as highlighted in this left figure. However, as we move up the justice spectrum, increasing self-reports of justice, we're seeing an increasing preference for environmental related values, which is sort of supporting this idea that, okay, if you really are struggling in the world, environmental issues are not necessarily forefront of mind. So next slide, please. So then the question is, well, how do we start to support groups who don't necessarily have biodiversity forefront of mind? And so we started looking at the networks that are currently in place in Urban Plan, and we wanted to identify those networks and issues of social inclusion or exclusion. Next slide. And what we did is we did a multi-level analysis where we looked at the relationships between the state policies and state networks, which has a strong mandate of the ghetto law to basically refurbish and regenerate these areas. We looked at the municipal policies and stakeholders, who interestingly have some different drivers around supporting marginalised neighbourhoods, around supporting fellowship and diversity in voice, versus the district level initiatives where they have funding for the Urban Plan Partnership to bring diverse groups together to support biodiversity and climate adaptation, and very grassroots initiatives where there's a very strong focus on the sharing economy and green entrepreneurs helping residents develop that sharing economy through employing them, for example, in the production of honey on the local site. So this is starting to highlight the fact that while there might be a national driver that is against social inclusion but is supporting climate, there's other things happening at the local level around care that are facilitating and translating, or what Natalie is calling reauthoring, these laws and these strategies in a way that is important to local people. And that sort of relates to Jennifer's point before, that cities and and non-government organisations are important bridges and translators of information and political directives into a way that is important for local people. So next slide. So the main messages today is that the design and implementation of NBS may not be forefront of mind for highly vulnerable groups. Relational values and needs are key to the long-term management of urban green infrastructure, including the scaling out of nature-based solutions. And we talked about these networks of care as being foundational to any NBS initiative. That they have an important role in reauthoring national and regional directives to meet local needs. Returning to the concept of mosaic governance, which is all about engaging active citizen groups and diverse interests, we need to think about these networks of care being multi-level, having different reaches, and mediating different political interests. So next slide. Thank you very much. I think that's my 5 minutes. Welcome you to look up more on the Viva Plan website, or alternatively, if you have some specific questions, please email me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think that's a very good input from your side. That also makes us aware that we also need to take into account, like, not also the people that are not the usual suspects, people that sometimes maybe have different social problems, and probably nature biodiversity is not their first objective, but they have other things. And I think that's an issue all over the world. You can find it even in Germany, and as you would say, you can find it in Denmark as well as in South Africa. And I think it's quite important, like, not to start probably then with biodiversity maybe, but to see, like, what is the connecting point to these people, and then start thinking about how can we create nature-based solutions that still fit with their demands and needs. We know it's not easy, but I can just echo, I would think it's exactly, but we have to do that. So we cannot ignore it, even if it's time consuming and resource intensive. But if we don't want to leave out those people, which is really important, then I think it's a must have. So many thanks for this insight. And I definitely will look up your project and see how this will develop, because it looks super interesting. So many good luck with the next years. And the last speaker is Ingrid Kotzier. Hi to Cape Town, South Africa. We're really happy to have you here. Ingrid has more than 30 years experience in sustainability and governance. Your work focuses on mainstreaming nature, its benefits, and nature-based solutions into urban planning and decision-making in cities and city regions to help again, like to become cities more healthy and more resilient and livable places. And you also serve as a technical lead on ICLE's biodiversity advocacy work. And you also work a lot with local and subnational governments. Your presentation, Ingrid, you will focus on the work that ICLE has done in promoting and implementing nature-based solutions in cities. You focus on examples, experience, and this is good. Now we're going to the global south. Of course, we've been already like in Santiago de Chile. Now we're going to Africa. And to give a slightly different perspective, how NBS are being applied, what are the challenges, and what are the lessons learned. And I will start your presentation right now, Ingrid, and mute myself so that you can start. 1 minute.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sandra. It's really very excited to be here as part of this panel, and it's quite a difficult task that I have now following on Jennifer and Christopher's excellent presentations. But I want to say that for ICLE, being part of this Naturvation Conference is quite a special thing, because we have quite a close association with Naturvation, certainly through our European Secretariat, but then the ICLE Cities Biodiversity Center, where I am located, also has worked very closely with Naturvation and the team in developing part of our Cities with Nature platform. If you can take me to the next slide. Yeah. And maybe if you can just give it in full slide.
Yeah, or I'm sorry, I'm just like, that's the difficulty that I have right now. I'm just trying that.
Not a problem.
Maybe you can maybe you start talking and I try to do magic behind. I'm sorry.
Exactly. I'm an African woman, I can do it. It's not a problem. If you can just say thank you. So I think one of the things that I want to talk about this morning, and I'm going to make a few general observations first, and then I will speak to specific, I've got 2 case studies, and I'm going to focus on one. And it's interesting when we talk about nature-based solutions within an African context, we'll find that there are many examples of nature-based solutions being applied in Africa. We might have different, different names. We talk about ecological infrastructure approaches, etc., etc. And we don't necessarily within the African context always sort of package or label it as nature-based solutions. Africans are very practical people. We tend to just get on with the job, and we're very driven by the challenges and the constraints that we have in this continent. But it leads to a lot of very interesting innovation. And I think that, you know, if I look at the sorts of examples that we've been seeing talked about in this conference, and also that you read about in the literature, you'll see that within African cities, and that goes for across the continent, there are many examples of where cities are involved in restoring wetlands, for example, or recreating even wetlands to deal with issues of water security, which is a big thing on my continent, flood attenuation, also for cultural and recreational purposes, and for tourism benefits. Open spaces are used for a number of reasons, and they are often associated with natural solutions around how you can use. You can see here on the left hand, that's a picture on the left hand where these green spaces along pavements, this is a city in Tanzania, are used partly for, there's a pawpaw tree, you know, it's sort of, it's urban food gardens, as it were, informal urban food gardens. And it also serves the purpose of, you know, greening the space and heat island reduction. We have interesting projects too, where we have on a catchment level, multi-level governance projects that deal with solving water security, water flow, water quality issues on a natural, using natural solutions. So where we restore wetlands and restore and protect water course bodies, etc. I think something else that's also worth mentioning within the African context is that if we look at it from an academic or very technical perspective, then we probably would need to say that not everywhere, but often and in many cities, particularly the smaller cities, nature-based solutions are not necessarily that well understood, particularly in those cities where they're characterized by very fast-growing cities. You don't typically get a situation where nature-based solutions are part of the narrative around budgeting and development priorities and dealing with infrastructure. And I think this is in part due to the fact that the challenges facing cities in Africa are around, one thing, for example, the level of informality. A city like Dar es Salaam has very high levels of informality. There's also competing demands on budgets for infrastructure, health-related issues, education, and COVID has exacerbated this. I mean, COVID, for one, has shown the inequalities in our cities. We know all about that. But also it's created a complication in the sense that cities, their budgets are being under stress, because on the one hand, they have reduced revenue generation as a result of economic problems from COVID. And on the other hand, they've got debt. They've got to get, their health services are being pressurized, and they're having to improve health services. So this is all part of the picture when we deal with nature-based solutions in Africa. And if you take me to the next slide, the point that I want to make here is that very often cities in Africa have, just go back to the previous slide. Cities in Africa don't necessarily have, it's a picture of Dar es Salaam. That's it. Thank you. So Dar es Salaam, for example, as I said, has got very high levels of informality. This is the existing sort of, or the established part of the city, and on the outskirts in the background, it's almost 70% of the city is informal. And one of the problems of these fast-growing cities is that their baselines, their plans, their the sort of accuracy and the up-to-dateness and the reliableness of their data sources is not always up to date, and it's a big problem. And one of the things that you'll find in a city like Dar es Salaam is that people are still very reliant, and they dependent on nature, as it were, because it's a livelihood. You'll see here there's some artisanal fishers. They fish for their living. They fish for also just for the pot. Certainly, food is an important part. I showed you a previous picture where you can see that within the sort of pavements or the city corridors, transport corridors, there are, urban food gardens and things planted. And another thing about Dar es Salaam is we mustn't forget that it's in one of the biodiversity hotspots. It's located in the East African coastal forest. So this is a very threatened environment as well. And I think that it's also important to understand that often within these contexts, the governance systems are very complex. If you can move to the next slide, please. What I want to show you is an example of how we came into Dar es Salaam. We had funding from the German IKI fund. And one of the things that the city wanted to do, they said, it was a whole biodiversity mainstreaming project. And they said to us, look, we've got a lot of open space. Some of it is formal park area, but a lot of it is just, it's just open space. It might be derelict, or it's not properly planned. We have some budget, but we don't know how to strategically prioritize that budget. The one thing that we realized is that they didn't understand what their asset was, what their natural assets were in the city. And they didn't have any way of identifying what the ecosystem services were, what the nature's contributions to people were in Dar es Salaam. So we embarked upon this project where we developed what we call the thematic atlas. And the idea of this atlas is that we developed it through a process of co-design, co-production. We involved the people from the city, both the stakeholders, the experts, as well as city officials. And we started getting them to talk about nature's contributions to people, to identify what the challenges were and what the issues were on the one side, and what the benefits of nature were on the other side. And we didn't have the luxury of having very detailed and scientific up-to-date databases and assessments and analyses done. We literally sat sometimes out in open, sometimes in offices with big maps, aerial photo maps, and we just plotted where these ecosystems were. If you move to the next slide, I'm going to show you what one of the outcomes was. And this was a map of the heat and air pollution corridors. If you go to my following slide, I'll show you just very quickly that there was a similar project done in Lilongwe, where we looked at water security as a result of too much development along a riverbank and pollution in the riverbank, and how you can alleviate water security and flooding issues by just recreating the river verges and removing the waste through composting as a nature-based solution. And if you take me to the final slide, just very quickly to say that I think one of the things that ICLEI has tried to do is to set up what we call the Cities with Nature platform, where cities can share and connect and learn for each other on an online platform, and they can see what's happening in other cities, how other cities are dealing with similar problems by going through this journey that we take them. Thank you so much for that, Sandra.
Thank you, Ingrid. That was also, like, I think, really good to see, like, what are the challenges in Africa, and like also like the lacking awareness of the services that nature-based solutions can provide, how people really benefit from it. So I think that's very important also to see like this large-scale interventions, which of course similarly important like the slow one. So we have only 10 minutes left. So what we now do, we take right away like the questions from the audience, and this will be sort of, I suggest, let's do like sort of a speed questioning. So I put the question, and you have not a lot of time to answer that. And I will always say like to whom the question is directed. So I saw the first question was from Hanson Borgström to Jennifer, and he asked like, how can we mobilize beyond COVID so that some best practices here are not being lost post the current phase of the pandemic?
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to highlight a report from our friends at the Coalition for Urban Transitions, which is the economic case for greening the global recovery through cities. That report looks at 7 different sectors, including nature-based solutions, and the real value, economic value and jobs potential that come from nature-based solutions, among several other sectors there. I think if we can create an economic story that also has an equity message, this is really where we can see that it's not just about nature, biodiversity, climate change, but it's really about a bigger picture message. Also, maybe just a final, what I've been seeing in Santiago and loving after so many months of being really mandated inside for almost 5 months, not being allowed to leave, now that the streets are closing and we're having lunch out on a quiet neighborhood. I mean, it's not yet green, but it's already showing you the potential. How can we, survey citizens and say, what kind of cities do you want to live in? Now you've seen the difference. And even now that our society is starting to open up again here in Santiago, you see many more bikes. You see fewer cars. This is a transitional phase, but really kind of creating that momentum, creating an economic and a social justice story, as we also heard from our friends in Helsinki and in ICLEI, that this is really where we can really picture. It's not just about nature, it's really about the full sustainability package.
Thank you, Jennifer, also for emphasizing that it should be a systemic, holistic approach that needs to be taken. Next question to you, Chris. How can we ensure that nature-based solutions are targeting the vulnerable communities that would benefit from them the most? This is from Claire Cooper.
Yes, very interesting question. I think it's linked to the response to the other question, that if we really want to target the vulnerable communities, we have to target it in a way that is, communicate that in a way that is salient to them. And if you start talking about nature-based solutions, they are going to say, first of all, what is that? And second of all, that doesn't relate to me. I've got income worries, education worries, safety and security worries ahead of all that. So then the question needs to become, how can we help you through all your immediate needs around feeling safe, secure, having a viable livelihood through nature-based solutions as the secondary element to that. So NBS becomes the vehicle through which we address other concerns. And I think that's the way we can engage with vulnerable groups in nature-based solutions. And there was a related question here about how we're doing that, and we're starting to do that in Viva Plan through what we're calling these hackathons, where we're trying to find out what are the problems of these groups, the challenges, and how do we translate these problems into opportunities by helping them rethink the way that they can use green space and other spaces around them, but also working with the wider powers around how these new neighbourhoods are designed so that they don't just become concrete jungles.
Thank you very much. So let's see, like the hackathons is not just something for the kids, but also probably for other people. So really excited to see how you're going to deploy this. A question to Ingrid, before we almost have to wrap up already. This is from Audrey Gerber. Ingrid, how do you see the influence of the IUCN global standards for nature-based solutions, which have been launched recently, for the wider implementation of nature-based solutions?
I think that those standards are extremely important. One of the things that we've seen is that there are some applications of nature-based solutions that are not necessarily fit for purpose, and they lead to bigger problems. And these problems, for example, if you are using invasive or non-native species to resolve a particular issue, it can lead to invasions which then cost money, and then you have to clean your water courses to get your water security back. So those standards are important. The one thing that does concern me, though, is that the standards are not localized, or they need to be interpreted into a way that can be applied easily at the city level. At the moment, the standard works, I think, well for a global and certainly within the business sector. We've recently had a webinar series on the application of standards, particularly to the city. And one of the things that did come out is, although that cities are identified as a target audience, we need to now dive down and develop and interpret and set up guidelines and training programs to city administrators, to city planners, to city engineers, and also to the companies that work at the city level around how do you actually apply that. And I think importantly also to the people that fund these nature-based solution projects at city level.
Thank you. I think that's also a nice message to we need tailored approaches, and we cannot come with our research messages. It must always be applied to the context, and the contexts are always different and the target groups. So I take the last question from the audience before we wrap up with a question for each of the speakers. The last question goes to you, Jennifer. And Merhem Kilek is asking, in high-dense metropolitan areas like Cairo, Egypt, where human needs or development needs are often being prioritized over nature, how could we save or rebuild the human-nature bonds?
Mm-hmm. Well, firstly, let me say I have not been to Cairo, so I think working with our colleagues at ICLE Africa would be very relevant here to make sure that we give a full answer. But I think I would say to work cross-sector. I talked a lot about cycling and urban air quality. And, that was to be a little bit provocative, but it's about, how are we planning and designing our cities, understanding that they are really dense in the center, but how much of that space is right now dedicated to cars that could be shifted over if we had better mobility systems, whether it's better public transport or cycling, that some of that car space could be rededicated to nature. And sometimes that's a way to do that is to do it temporarily. Something that has been working quite effectively here in South America is the idea of tactical urbanism, kind of short-term interventions, painting streets, bringing in street trees, showing and envisioning how we could create different types of cities before we roll it out collectively. And then working with people, working with the local government for sure, but also, kind of bringing this story in slowly into citizens. When we talk to families, talk to children about urban health and urban air quality, talking to local businesses, what are the value of nature to them? So it's a different story, but it's a connected story. But then again, I would say that this is something that we'd like to work with partners on so that it's really a local story first and foremost.
Thank you. We have 1 minute left, and let's see if they take us 30 seconds more. So be super short. This is now the wrap-up question. There will be no wrap afterwards. And this is the place where I would like to thank you, all the people who organized the session, these lovely speakers, and also Ling Jung and Anya, who are the chat monitors and were so kind and looking through the questions and putting them back to us. Here, this is now your wrap-up question. So you three speakers, please forget about real world constraints. There are not such constraints at the moment. If you would have the freedom to implement one action tomorrow to accelerate the implementation of nature-based solutions, what would that be? Who's that? Okay, let's start. Let's go let's start with Ingrid.
I think for me that would be around investment in nature-based solutions, and with investment, a huge effort around building the case and helping people at the local level, whether they are city fathers or mothers or children or businessmen or city leaders, understand that this is something for all of us and we need to take ownership of it and apply it.
Thank you. Chris, you're next.
Yeah, I think it's about all these intermediary and boundary organisations and how do we fund them to support these translating the needs of vulnerable groups into state and national policy so that we don't have this chasm between the directives at the national level from the needs at the local level.
Thank you. Jennifer, so we had financing, we had the integration into policies. What would be your action if you would have the power?
In a visionary world, I would say let's pull out our shovels and dig up those car parking spaces, and starting in lower income neighborhoods and connecting them across our cities, and planting them with local climate resilient street trees, green roofs, everything. But yeah, let's pull out those shovels and take up that parking.
Perfect. And this is actually what I saw last year when we went to Bogota. They really did it, and the police was not really, they knew, but it was not working. So maybe we should just try it out. I think, thank you very much. That was a lot. Of course, time was too short, but it was, I think, a really insightful presentations from all of you. Thanks for the discussions. And then for all of you, you can then have fun with the next panels and expert talks. Goodbye.
Thank you.